In this, our sixth installment with author James Lindgren, we talk about the South Street Seaport from his book, Preserving Maritime America, A Cultural History of the Nation's Great Maritime Museums. We also talk about the perspective and conclusion from his book and what the future holds for the maritime museums of the United States on this, the NASO Video Podcast. The North American Society for Oceanic History was created by maritime scholars who met in 1971 at the University of Maine. They recognized that in North America there was no forum for maritime history or a society devoted to the study and promotion of maritime history. The aim of the original group of organizers was to create a diverse organization based initially on Canadian and American membership, which would gain the interest of others. Now there are members worldwide, and it is this diversity of membership that continues to make NASO a truly unique organization. 2020 marked the first year in recent memory that NASO was unable to meet, and therefore we bring historians, archaeologists, and students who are scheduled to present. Make sure I got everything here. Okay. All right, Jim, that brings us to your sixth museum you looked at, which is where we kind of started right at the beginning there with South Street Seaport. So I was wondering if you can discuss South Street Seaport for us.
Okay. South Street Seaport actually is a unique case in not only U.S. historic preservation, but also maritime museums. As you can see in this slide that you've got posted, it dealt with an urban renewal zone. Much of this territory, again, a dozen or so blocks, was destined for the bulldozer. And the idea hatched by David Rockefeller of Chase Manhattan Bank was to build the World Trade Center here, the famous World Trade Center. It was moved though from the East River, which you see in this slide, to the Hudson River because of pressure from New Jersey's governor. Nonetheless, South Street was destined for the dumpster until the museum was organized in 1966 by Peter Stanford. He was a 30-ish advertising executive, and he was inspired by Carl Cordum's effort in San Francisco. Cordum, if you remember, was one who hatched this idea to have a private museum, which was the San Francisco Maritime Museum. It opened in 1951, but also to persuade Sacramento to establish a state maritime museum right next door in the bay. And that was done, and Stanford went there in 65 and saw it, and he was wowed by it. He came back to New York with his wife Norma and wanted to do the same thing on this section of Lower Manhattan. One effort was parallel at the time. Whitney North Seymour, who was a Wall Street lawyer, and his father was a famous preservationist of the city, also wanted to create a state maritime museum there. So these two efforts went side by side in 66. Seymour was able to get the legislature up in Albany to pass a bill establishing the museum, but the governor at this time was Nelson Rockefeller, brother of David Rockefeller. And David just didn't like the idea of the state funding the museum on what was his backyard, and on territory that he wanted to use for commercial development. And so the New York State Maritime Museum was created, but it was not funded. It only existed on paper through the duration of the following years. Peter Stanford instead again went forth with his people's movement, trying to get this South Street Seaport Museum going, and it officially opened in 67. It was unique because, as you can see, the buildings were dilapidated. It was in many ways a no-go area for much of the city population. And in line with Jane Jacobs' idea of putting eyes on the street, Stanford wanted to bring people down to South Street Seaport, as he called it, to enjoy this old area. Some buildings go back to the late 1700s. Most are from the 1800s. Some are actually from the early 1900s. But it was the largest, again, unrestored section of New York City at the time that was historic. And Schermerhorn Row, which is in this photo, occupies the area to the left. It goes back to the early 1800s, 1812, built on landfill. And this is what Stanford focused on, and Whitney North Seymour focused on, because it was the most important building. They won an important ally. Ada Louise Huxtable was, again, an architectural critic for the New York Times, and she didn't like Rockefeller's plan, again, David Rockefeller's plan to create a phony Williamsburg-style restoration close to Wall Street. So she latched on to South Street Seaport and endorsed Peter Stanford's drive and gave it her editorial imprimatur. As a result, South Street Seaport began to move in the late 60s, but it had this fundamental problem of money. This area, which was initially 13 square blocks, this area was probably the most expensive piece of real estate in New York at the time because developers eyed it. It's just catty corner from Wall Street. It's right there on the East River, as you can see. It's, again, a lot of potential when it came down to real estate. And as we all know, in 2020, real estate tycoons often force their way into projects and face, again, public opposition, but do as they will. And so Peter Stanford faced a lot of opposition from real estate developers until he found a friend. His name was Jacob Eastbranson. Jacob Eastbranson was, again, the head of a shipping line. He was worth well over $150 million. And Jacob Eastbranson agreed to secretly buy parcels in the area so as to block skyscrapers from being developed. It was a wonderful plan when you think about it, because if he bought one or two lots on a block, no one could build a skyscraper there. And so he was a spoiler. And his idea was to eventually acquire, as he did, over 50 buildings. And he was of a mixed mind. He said he would donate them to the Seaport as kind of a trust. He wanted to develop a few of his own as, again, real estate profit. But Eastmanson's plan was one which ran afoul, because New York City has this boom or bust cycle. And the boom began to occur because on the other side of the island, 1 mile down Fulton Street, was the World Trade Center going up at the same time. And so the boom led to that construction. But once the World Trade Center came online, there was just too much office space in New York, particularly Manhattan. And so Eastmanson lost his fortune. The museum essentially, again, lost its endowment. At the same time, it was acquiring a fleet, the fleet that you can see here in the background on the East River. The East River was still a functional river at this time. You can see two, again, square riggers there, Balclutha, and again, Peking, plus a whole fleet of other ships that Stanford had either brought into the museum's fold or had docked there to kind of create this mini fleet that impressed New Yorkers about their maritime past. Peter Stanford was one who realized that his effort was financially tenuous, but he always put his faith in people. One of his advisors, again, an area businessman who actually ran a garbage business with the Fulton Fish Market, Joe Canalipo, said, "Yeah, you can't forget the fact that a museum is people." And so Stanford brought as many people down to the Seaport as possible. He was helped by a lot of artists. Pete Seeger, for one. Pete Seeger loved coming to the Seaport in the late 60s, early 70s. He loved singing on the dock. He would, again, dock his own boat there, go into Greenwich Village for the weekend. And he lent kind of a star appeal to the Seaport Museum. The Seaport Museum grew in the 70s. It really reached its height pretty much with the bicentennial of the American Revolution in 1976. The Seaport Museum and its wharfs were seen as one of the main festival points for the celebration. Operation Sail, again, long flotilla of ships crossing through the Verrazano Narrows, 18 miles long, 5 million plus people watching this fleet. America's connection to its maritime history was really strengthened by OpSail. And so there was this kind of success to the Seaport Museum, a success that was kind of skin deep, though, because the museum was facing financial trouble. Because its finances were so insecure, the board changed. The board became one which was composed mostly of corporate CEOs, suburbanites, people who didn't have that commitment to urban restoration, people who didn't have that commitment to a kind of a democratic, popular movement of people, the museum as people concept. And these people brought in, again, opposite change, because at this very same time, the chairman of the board, who was, again, chief operating officer of Time Life, Jim Shepley was his name. He, again, had a friend in developer, James Rouse, who opened Quincy Market in Boston in 1976, 77, 78, a three-phase project. And Quincy Market became the model for what Shepley and Rouse wanted to do to South Street Seaport. And so it was really taken over by corporate capitalism. And as a result, what you see happen is at the very same time as New York City itself is facing bankruptcy, at the same time that the New York State government is, again, similarly facing financial hardship, the South Street Seaport is taken over by these businessmen who want to build a mall on the waterfront. Festival marketplaces were a trend. They were built all along the Atlantic shore. They were ones that were kind of ephemeral hits. The first phase of the festival marketplace opened in 1983 on the East River. The second phase, which was, again, Pier 17, opened in 1987. And they seemed at first to be success, but it was an illusion. New York City is notorious for trends. And the trend at first was to embrace them. Fulton Street and its mall was on the front cover of the New Yorker, but New Yorkers tired of it. It was too commercial. It was too geared to business and not authentically rooted in New York City's past. The 1980s, as we know, was a period of inflation and then a recession. And this led to more and more trouble for the festival marketplace. All the while, the museum itself is kind of floundering, and its identity is in doubt. In the middle of the 80s, it brought in a new president, Peter Neal. Peter Neal came from the National Trust, and his idea was to somehow professionalize the operation. He had this albatross on his shoulder. That was, again, the mall, the marketplace, the business orientation. The museum was kind of lost in the shuffle. And as the museum became less and less obvious, New Yorkers were more and more skeptical, more and more critical of what was going down at South Street Seaport. Neal turned things around pretty much in the early 90s, largely through educational programs. New York City schools, New York State kids, again, go usually in 4th grade or 7th grade on field trips. And up to 70% of South Street's budget came from educational programs. At the same time, the elder hostel movement again became again a fitting venue for a lot of seniors. More and more people came in through that route. So through the 1990s, the museum stabilized, but it had this gigantic expense, and that was the fleet. The fleet is, as every museum that's got ships knows, is expensive to maintain. And you've got two square riggers that require a lot of effort and a lot of money plus a fleet of schooners and other boats to go along with it. And so Neil had again an expense that had to be faced, and he pleaded for help from New York City. One of the aspects as the museum was going financially insolvent in the 70s was that the city acquired much of this territory. Jacob Ismerson lost his ownership, the city acquired it, and so the city leased the property to the Seaport Museum, but the Seaport Museum was one that wasn't bringing enough of the revenue. So in the 1990s, again, the museum is facing this crisis. It's on city land. It's asked the city to help it financially. Every other museum in New York City that's located on city property receives an operating subsidy. South Street Seaport was the only one not to receive it. And this is, again, to be explained by a lot of reasons, one of which was the mayor of this time, Rudolph Giuliani, did not like the Seaport Museum because he associated it with the Fulton Fish Market, which had been pretty much controlled for decades by the local mafia. And Giuliani, again, refused to provide the subsidy. And so by the turn of the century, as 2000 gave way to 2001, we've got this problem in that the Seaport Museum needs a financial boost. Then comes the tragedies. The tragedy, obviously, September 11th, the simultaneous attacks on Trade Center 1 and 2, plus points elsewhere. That led in New York to almost a 2-year subsidence, a 2-year lapse in education programs, in tourism, and the Seaport Museum's finances were deeply in the red. At the same time, the Seaport Museum is going through administrative crisis. There's been this battle between those who support a museum and its educational effort versus those who are more corporate business minded who want to make a buck off of the place. Both forces were on the board, and that led to, again, a shakeup. And the museum is going through this administrative crisis, which is just embarrassing to it. And the museum is much ridiculed in the New York press and community. A third crisis, the first being 2001, the second being the administrative dilemma. Third crisis came in 2012. This is when Superstorm Sandy, what others called Hurricane Sandy, hit New York. It swept up the coast. By the time it hit the city, it was a superstorm, but still led to over a 7-foot surge sweeping through lower Manhattan. And any building with its infrastructure, its heating, its ventilation, its AC, whatever the case, any building with that's again, infrastructure below that 7-foot level is going to face problems. And Schermerhorn Road was one of those. The Seaport Museum had developed a functioning museum on the 3rd and 4th floors. It was an interesting case of presenting the city to its people. It had no money to repair it. The city and the feds refused to fund it, and the Schermerhorn Museum displays closed. They are still closed to this day. Here we are again 8 years later, almost on the anniversary of Superstorm Sandy. And so what that led to was, again, a further dilemma, and the museum was imperiled. Whether it would close or not was a daily question. Finally, the city, again, encouraged the Museum of the City of New York to step in. The Museum of the City of New York is a private museum. It's located, again, in the north part of Central Park. It had been looking for a downtown location. It was coaxed to temporarily run South Street Seaport until, again, new administration could be brought in. The Department of Cultural Affairs, which is, again, part of New York City's government, provided some seed money. But the real effort, again, to get South Street Seaport Museum moving was halted by the fact that the real power barons in the New York City establishment is the Economic Development Corporation. It's again a semi-private, semi-public, autonomous organization. Its members are appointed by the council and the mayor, but it wanted again to make money off of the Seaport district, which had become a historic district back in the late 1970s. And as a result, the Museum of the City of New York asked for aid. It didn't get it. It asked for, again, changes in the lease that the city provided. It didn't get it. It's all, again, blocked by the Economic Development Corporation, the EDC, which is this power baron. And so when you look at the 1910s for South Street Seaport, it's going through this transition, a transition which is still going on till today. A transition where it needs, again, operating revenues that it can earn. Museums have got to rest like a chair on four legs. There's got to be, again, money gained through membership, money gained through programs, money gained through philanthropy, and money gained through, again, some type of public support. And the public support increased from New York City during the 1910s, largely because, particularly after 2014, when Mayor de Blasio came in, there was a wish on the part of the city council to support the South Street Seaport Museum. So today, if you think about the Seaport Museum, its fleet has been cut by over 50%. It still has, again, one square rigger waiver tree, and that square rigger is again at Pier 16. The Peking has been returned to Germany. Again, a loss for the city, but a boost for the preservation of the ship. South Street is unable even to maintain its schooners today. So the museum is in a transition period, trying to find the money necessary to keep its wherewithal, to keep its programs, to keep its fleet, to keep its identity going. And that is, again, the question, because when it comes down to New York City is a very money-oriented, it's a here and now type of population, just the ability to cultivate appreciation for New York's connections to the sea, how New York City had been once the major port of the world. To kind of cultivate that historical memory is difficult in a city that is so geared to the here and the now and the buck behind it all. So when you think of South Street Seaport, it began with this hope that, well, a museum is people. And the question today in 2020 is how to find those people and get those people further involved.
I so remember just as a kid being down at South Street Seaport, and I go back to, like, I think it was early 2000s, it must have been about 2003 or so. We had a conference, NASO had a conference, and we did it jointly with the National Maritime Historical Society, which Peter Stanford was one of the key founders of, and
Right.
we took a tour down to South Street Seaport with him, and which was just, it was amazing. It was just listen to Peter talk about all these things about South Street Seaport. I mean, he has like an ownership of it. So it was really amazing to be down there. And then you talk about his Bronson. I mean, his shipping line was famous in American history for its coastal trade, and then linked to American export lines later on. It's just, it's such a nexus of American history, New York City and the harbor right there. And it's amazing how many, just even within that city knows nothing about it. And I always think the education aspect of it was such a key element for South Street Seaport to survive and really thrive and start educating people on the history. It's always amazing to me that people can live literally on an island surrounded by water and know very little about their own maritime history. And where South Street Seaport finds itself today is distressing to me, because I think it was such a magical place to go into and see. I remember the Fulton Fish Market. I remember being down there. There was always a unique aroma to South Street Seaport in the early 1980s. So it was a fascinating place.
Yeah, when I doing my research, I stayed in a hotel in the district, and I got up at 4 just to get to the fish market as it was operating.
Right.
And again, walking over the dead fish on the streets and seeing the burly working class guys going at it. The smell, as you said, it had a very different subculture to it, but it's so contrary to the gentrification that was going on in the city. And so it was an anachronism there. And eventually it moved to the Bronx, largely because the federal government demanded safety standards. But the loss of the seaport, loss of the fish market to the seaport, is just kind of a telling example of how Lower Manhattan is changing and still continues to change. It goes on.
I thought it was such a great. It actually added so much to the Seaport. It really did when you were down there. I mean, it was very blue collar, and you appreciated it down there
Yeah.
when you were there. I want to get you over talking about the conclusion here of your book, because I think one of the things you talk about is how these six uh, museums are regionally based, very loosely knit, and so I want you to kind of talk a little bit about that conclusion, and where do you see the prospect for preserving maritime America is, in the present and the future going forward.
Yeah, I think the conclusion is the most important part of the book. And it took a lot of thought on my part to pull it all together. Because as I was told by readers early on, I've got 6 separate stories, 6 separate museums. How does it all come together? Each of these museums started with a global ambition, whether it's Salem's merchants who want to conquer the markets of far, far away, or New Bedford whalers who were in, again, North Pacific, who were all over the place. Whatever the case was, we've got cities that have a global orientation, but as these museums were changing, they became more and more focused on their locale. Partly that's because that's where their turnstile was, that's where their philanthropists were. It's also because they realized that they had to tie land and sea together. And so as I approached the conclusion, I realized that this is a change that in many ways defines this inward-looking sense of how Americans approach the globe. What matters for the bottom line is what happens on Main Street, or happens at the main wharf, what happens right there. And so as I brought the conclusion together, I realized that all these years of work that I had done, this project began in 1980, and here we're talking in 2020. This is the 40th anniversary of this work. So this isn't a slapdash effort. This has been much of my life over these last 4 decades. But as I brought this book together, I realized that certain themes stand out most of all. And that is, one, a museum has to change. It has to, again, in many ways, think of, as Joe Cantalupo said, a museum is people. And how do you relate history to those people? And who are those people? How do you get those people involved? And so the demographics of museum membership, museum support have been changing, and they are changing even now. Here we are speaking in the midst of the coronavirus, and these museums are just beginning to reopen with a lot of social distancing. They are going to have to reestablish their connection to the people. Some say that technology is the way to do that, the web, the internet. There's a lot of futurists who say that, again, institutions such as the Maritime Museum are old-fashioned and passé. They have to, again, focus on how to catch people through the World Wide Web. Except the World Wide Web doesn't pay the bills. The World Wide Web has got kind of an ephemeral catch on people. It's what one, again, education analyst back in the 30s called spectatoritis. Web hits just aren't effective as people coming to museum, being up close and personal with artifacts, people taking, again, a voyage on one of the ships that may go out to sea. And so when you think of one of these themes that I constantly emphasize is how to get people involved, how to become more involved. And I go through in the conclusion various attempts to do that. And so there's programs like boat building, there's programs like teaching how to sail, navigation skills. There's programs, again, on history. Programs are crucial to get people involved. Now, sometimes programs can be run over the web, teaching about history, for example. But the tactile skills that are involved in crafting wood into a boat are just irreplaceable. You can't do that on the web. It's got this personal effect on people that is, we hope, lasting. So one of the themes I focus on is, again, the programs that have again evolved at these places. Another theme I focus on, and again come to over and over again, is the fact that these museums have been competing with one another. They began as local efforts, regional efforts, but they, as national communications, national media, national everything has taken over, museums are stepping on each other's toes. As we know, there is a national history museum. It's called the Smithsonian, but the Smithsonian has kind of abdicated its custodianship of maritime history. There was a proposal back in the 70s to create a wing of the National Museum of American History. It came to nothing, but what that left to is that these local museums like Mystic Seaport or South Street Seaport or Mariners Museum began to step in 1997, through a congressional trick, Senator John Warner inserted a bill in which the Mariners Museum and South Street Seaport were called America's National Maritime Museum. This created anger and resentment on the part of the other museums. Mystic Seaport reciprocated by calling itself the Museum of America and the Sea. So we've got this rivalry that seems to be ever present. The rivalry comes through this organization going back to the 70s called the Council of American Maritime Museums. And it was designed to bring them together, but it's only the top tier of the museums which have joined it. Now, you mentioned Peter Stanford. Peter Stanford was, again, a visionary. He was a big idea person. One of his ideas was to create an organization to pull it all together. He did establish this magazine, historical magazine called Sea History. It began publishing 48 years ago, so it's long lasting, but it hasn't been able to stem the rivalry. So another theme I developed is just how to pull these disparate efforts together. What keeps them apart? What, in many ways, can the federal government do, if anything, to improve it? One of the stories I really like, and I kind of smile as I say, is that Senator Edward Kennedy thought, well, one idea to promote preservation and to pull these groups together is to create a national trust for historic ships. It was, again, I think a great idea if you believe in ship preservation, but the current National Trust for Historic Preservation fought tooth and nail behind the scenes as well as in the public relations sector to block it. And that is indicative of the fact that the federal government has been very ineffective in promoting, again, historic preservation of ships. Now, you know, in Europe and England and France and the Netherlands and these countries, the national government is the one that funds a lot of these efforts. The national government creates, through legislation, creates monies to promote preservation. It's been very difficult in the United States to do that, partly because Congress is more interested in land resources, local courthouses, local historic districts. It hasn't been able to support shipping. So what we see is these organizations, which are regional, have never been able to get Congress to move into action. I can't go into everything, but one of the things that I really like readers to think about is environmentalism, because environmentalism is slow to gain the attention of many museums. Today in 2020, once the COVID crisis passes, we're going to focus more and more on how important it is to save the environment in which we live. And many museums early on said, well, that's an effort for environmentalists. Museums were historical or history-minded. And so for long years, the museums kind of dodged the issue of environmental education. It began to change, ironically, with New Bedford. As I said before, New Bedford is one of my favorite little museums. And it began in the late 80s when New Bedford hired an environmentalist as its director. The change came to fruition in the early 21st century. And the change is indicated by a display, an exhibit it had. It's called From Pursuit to Preservation. It's a study of whaling. That's the title of chapter 2 in the book. And what the display, the exhibit looks at is how attitudes towards whales are indicative of our attitudes towards nature. And again, the museum was founded with the glorification of killing this large mammal. Here we are in the 21st century. There are, again, concerted efforts to save those who remain. And the exhibit follows that. The exhibit opened in 2009. It ran for 9 years. And it kind of shows how the museum was reorienting itself towards the theme of environmentalism. I mentioned in the conclusion that New Bedford had also wanted a partnership with a local aquarium that was developing, a public-private partnership. Well, the private partnership was again possible. It needed government money. Governor Mitt Romney of Massachusetts, President George W. Bush of the United States refused to support it. And so it's another example of how important it is to have, again, a sympathetic, supportive federal authority in there to support our nation's maritime history. And so that's a theme I like to mention right there, is how environmentalism has become more and more the issue. As I said, there's a lot of themes in the book, and I encourage folks to kind of page through the conclusion, because there's a lot of food for thought about where the museum movement is going. And had I published my book now in the midst of COVID-19, I would have added a section, because these museums have gone through, again, a crisis of money and attendance, a crisis that we still don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Ironically, the book was supposed to come out a few years ago. I signed a contract with another press. The press reneged on the deal, unfortunate for me and I think them. And that again, extra year or two gave me a chance to strengthen the conclusion more, as I thought about these issues that have been staring at me for the past 40 years of writing about historic preservation and maritime history. So as I mentioned, this book isn't a slapdash effort. Some of my colleagues at other institutions are able to spend a couple of years of research and produce a book on a more narrow field. I chewed off too much, obviously, with this. And as I mentioned in our beginning, I have enough material to write books on each of these museums. But as my brain cells diminish and as my hair goes gray, I ain't gonna get there. So this is probably, again, my contribution to maritime history. I have hopes of writing one more book on San Francisco, but there's logistical problems in getting access and getting time and all that. But I think Preserving Maritime America is, as I mentioned at the very beginning, it's extremely unique. Nothing's like this in our research, and it's one that's tries to bring these museums up to how historians in the 21st century understand them. I might add also that museums kind of hold me off with a 10-foot pole at times, because they like to think of their history as a public relations issue. And here I am, an academic historian. I, again, write for not only an academic audience, but also an audience of educated folks who are interested in history. And I like to give them, as much as I can, an unvarnished look at the museums and our history, whereas museums themselves like to have a varnished look and emphasize the positive. I look at the positive, the negative, the many nuances in between, and try to cover the whole spread. So 40 years, and I used to have brownish hair, and again, well, a lot more vim and vigor.
Well, at least you have hair, Jim, so you have that going for you over me. I will, let me be clear. I think it's a magisterial work. I think it's fantastic. I would, want 2 more volumes based on the number of museums out there. And I think you hit on such key topics. The boat building is such a great thing. I know smaller maritime museums, Chesapeake Maritime Museum, the North Carolina Maritime Museum down in Beaufort, all use those education programs to bring kids in, to bring in young people, and do such a great work, because I do think there's a tactile element to teaching at times. And I think when you physically do it, it becomes alive to you in a way more so. And I think that's why it's so important to have watercraft at some of these museums too, because again, there's that touch to it. And you're right. One of the things that I come away with, I do a lot on maritime industry policy today and the current maritime industry. And what's amazing to me in reading your book and listening to you is museums and the structures are as fragmented as the maritime industry in itself in some ways. You have CAM, the Maritime Museums, you have us at NASO, you have SHEAR with the archaeologists, and sometimes they don't mesh well together and they don't get along well. And I in the maritime industry, it's the same way with unions and ship owners and builders and you name it. It's an industry that is, and a history that is so unique to the areas, and you can understand why these regional museums do spring up and why it's so hard for an entity like a Smithsonian to tackle a topic like this, because in many ways it's the history of the entire nation, and it's hard to put it all together in one wing in many ways. I think that's one of the biggest onuses out there. But I think it's so important because people are so misinformed about our maritime history that we forget exactly the role the sea plays, the lakes, the rivers, the oceans, all that plays, and it still does with us today. And so I think your work is such a great thing. And 40 years in writing a book, that's something to be proud of. That's I think that's the element that shows the amount of work that went in, and it shows in reading your book and seeing the elements you have. I'm going to be interested to see, we're posting each of these videos with links to the museums. We'll see if the museums link onto them and see how they like them. So
Stay tuned.
Well, we'll see. We'll see what they say and everything. But I want to thank James Lindgren for joining us on the NASO Video Podcast. This has actually been over a course of 2 days, not consecutive. They were separated by quite a bit because of some logistics issues. But I want to thank him for joining us. We're going to have links in the show notes to his book, Preserving Maritime America. I can't recommend it strong enough. Again, a runner-up for this year's John Lyman Award. In my opinion, I thought it was a hands-down winner, in my opinion. But there's some great books out there in maritime history. I would definitely get it. We'll have links to each of the maritime museums that are showcased in Jim's work. If you liked our video podcast, be sure to click like on YouTube and give it 5 stars in your podcast provider. Please subscribe to our channel so you can receive updates, new videos, and new interviews with maritime historians. You can follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at NASO_history. The best way to follow NASO is to become a member. As such, you receive our newsletter, our quarterly journal, the Northern Mariner, which we publish in concert with the Canadian Nautical Research Society. You can go to www.naso.org and click on membership to join. Again, I want to thank Jim Lindgren for taking his time, 2 days to meet with us. I just think this is some of my funnest discussions I've had in doing these podcasts. So I really enjoyed our time together. And to everyone out there, just keep sailing and stay safe. Thank you.
Yeah.